Okay, this is our Ruyer reading group, continuing our reading of Cybernetics and the Origin of Information. We're picking up from page 131 of the translation. So I think it was last time, or maybe the time before, that we started this chapter, the mixed origin of information. In this bit that we read through at the end of so we just started this chapter last time. This bit that we just read through, he talks about this kind of dilemma that runs through essentially the whole history of philosophy, having to do with the nature of explanation. So you're trying to explain something that is new or surprising, or in some sense that sort of calls for explanation. It seems like when we explain something, it means we're taking something that seems surprising or that seems new and sort of showing how it actually comes out of something that is not surprising or that we already understood. It seems like that's sort of part of what we mean by explaining something. And so explanation seems to kind of eliminate the possibility of this novelty or surprise or whatever you want to call it. So if you have something novel and then you explain it, it seems like you're reducing it to something already understood, to something not novel. And so the dilemma is that if we want to have some sort of understanding of novelty, like how do we have an understanding of the world that doesn't sort of eliminate novelty altogether in favor of explicability, or how can we have something that is both explicable and novel at the same time? And so there's like different sort of ways of dealing with this dilemma that more or less like pick one or the other. And so like he points to the sort of Platonist theory. So all the sort of phenomena of the world would be manifestations of some kind of these like eternal forms. Or there's the mechanistic theories where you have, these atoms or some sort of simple parts that interact with each other in simple ways and produce all of the surprising phenomena. So all the, living beings and humans with their ideas and social organizations and so on would all just be sort of these very complicated collections of tiny billiard balls bumping into each other. Or he mentions dialectical theories, and so he's obviously thinking of Hegel here, and there would be this sort of logical progression of the concept realizing itself over time. So in all these versions, they're all versions of sort of the same idea of like novelty as being sort of just almost illusory, in the sense that everything that seems to be novel, everything that is arising over time in this process is actually sort of there at the outset and just has to be kind of played out. And then the opposite side is various forms or different ways of sort of holding on to the novelty side, but sort of at the expense of the explanation side. So he points to C.S. Peirce and William James. I'm not that convinced that these are really sort of that it makes a lot of sense to sort of group these people together, but he points to them as both being representatives of this kind of absolute empiricism, where the experience of novelty or even surprise in the sort of general sense is an experience that we have to sort of accept alongside any other experience. So there's nothing that sort of privileges these supposed like atomic sensations, like an experience of red or an experience of C# or whatever. There's nothing that says this is like a more fundamental or a more real experience compared to the experience of surprise or the experience of novelty. And then another sort of variation would be these theories of emergence or creative evolution. He points to Bergson here, or this sort of notion of pure freedom, and he's thinking probably of Sartre for this. But this sort of idea that there's something that sort of arises, this kind of novelty that has there's no necessary connection with what came before. So, I mean, the sort of existentialist, the Sartre position is like the purest form of this, where like you have this sort of absolute freedom, absolute contingency that, even when you're sort of looking at these, large scale sort of macro historical processes where you can sort of trace how conditions at one time sort of lead to conditions at another time, if you kind of zoom in, that still is the product of all these free decisions of individual people. At any given time, people could have decided to, act in a different way, even though, given the circumstances that they were in, that's not the decision that they made. So there's always this sort of underlying absolute freedom, even if in reality the behavior of the people didn't sort of manifest that freedom. So all these are all variations of the other side where we sort of hold on to novelty and give up on explicability. So this sort of absolute freedom is something that could never, in principle, there's no way we could have, sort of predicted or determined what would have happened. It always could have happened in a different way, even if what actually did happen is something that was predictable based on these sort of social circumstances or whatever it was. In principle, things could have happened in a different way. And of course, what Ruyer is going to try to do is to overcome this distinction or this sort of dilemma, and get us a way of understanding how something could be both novel and explicable, or how we can have both sides of this dilemma, have our cake and eat it too. So that was our homework for this past week, was to come up with a way of overcoming this dilemma. So hopefully everyone has solved the whole history of philosophy in the last week, and we don't need to read the rest of the book. Okay, so I haven't heard any suggestions for the answer to the history of philosophy, so maybe we do need to read the rest of the book. Angus, do you want to take it? I think we're at the first full paragraph, these three theories. Actually, no, sorry, we read that one. It is even easier, I guess.
Yes, no problem. It is even easier to see the close kinship of these two last types of theories. They reject the notion of potentiality. They distrust concepts in logic, necessity, or determinism. While the three theories of the first type are theories of quote-unquote metaphysical fullness, the last two believe in quote-unquote metaphysical emptiness, which allows individual and unpredictable adventures, chances in the strong sense of the word, whereas chance in the Democritean and mechanist sense of the word seems to be only completing cases laid out in advance by possibility. Our own study of the origin of information through cybernetics has clearly led us toward theories of the first, Platonic type. How can we avoid the serious objections that it is so easy to put this type of theory, to this type of theory, especially that of quote-unquote useless doubling, and that our contemporaries, who are in general more seduced by novelty at the cost of rationality than by rationality at the cost of novelty, continue to emphasize? When it is a matter of mnemonic information, of the repetition of or of an organic form, the anti-Platonic objection is not serious. Since the billions of individuals who are born reproduce a specific form, the information of each individual must not be truly improvised and created each time ex nihilo. And if experiment demonstrates that there is no preformation in our space, we must conclude that there is a guiding preform beyond our space. A disciple of Meyerson would certainly be jubilant in the face of what would seem to him to be a simple, naive displacement of the problem, but he would be wrong. A reproduction does not have to be explained as a production. Since the form is not original, it is normal to seek its origin elsewhere. Certainly the idea of a transspatial type is at least as obscure as the spatial, but what can we do about it? The biological facts of reproductive information indicate that there is a supernature beyond spatio-temporal nature, which, by the way, is not at all supernatural in the theological sense of the word. We hardly see why we would not follow these indications just for the futile reason that the hypothesis of this transspatial world does not give a total and quote-unquote anhypothetical explanation. The Myersonian objection draws on a conception of science and philosophy that is too ambitious. Knowledge would never have progressed if we had been discouraged in advance from explaining A by B, because next it would be necessary to explain B by C, and so on. It is interesting to widen the sphere of what is known, even if we do not reach the point where the known becomes the intelligible. It is interesting to discover this world of mnemonic types beyond our physical space, to discover that there are several continents and quote nature, taken in a wider sense than that of spatio-temporal nature. Instead of discussing the legitimacy and meaning of a metaphysics beyond science in absolute terms, it would be good to define a more modest sort of metaphysics, which would be a cosmology of the knowable beyond the observable. The question changes aspect when it becomes a matter of truly novel information, that is, of invention and not of mnemonic. Not that it is permitted to make a clear-cut distinction between memory and invention, as we have often seen. On the one hand, the psychoorganic reproduction is never standardized. It is always able to be fine-tuned. On the other hand, an invention is never free. It resembles a typical reproduction in being guided by the watermark of a possibility. There are some genres and species and technical inventions, just as in organisms, and often the same ideas are born in several brains at the same time, just as multiple individuals of the same species can develop thousands of miles apart. However, the difference remains significant, and a theory of reminiscence for inventive information is somewhat naive and abrasive. Consider, for example, more recent technical machines. It would be ridiculous to say that the inventor of the bicycle was guided, like the young slave in the Meno, by the intuition memory of an ideal type, controlling his efforts, like a radar controls a DCA automatic. It would be ridiculous to say that as long as the bicycle had two irregular wheels and no freewheel, the inventor's minds were not quite satisfied, just as a man who is trying to remember the name Warburg is not satisfied as long as he only managed to grasp the distorted name Wollaston. Once the ideal mnemonic type is reached, the satisfying coincidence makes everybody happy, and the model of the bicycle evolves. It is not enough to abandon the mythic clothing of the Platonic theory to render it viable. It seems that much more needs to be almost everything. Organisms themselves resemble artifacts in many ways. And while it is ridiculous to imagine that the idea of the bicycle or the camera was sitting in the ideal world for all eternity, waiting to inspire inventors, it is almost as absurd to imagine the eye or the system of muscular nerves of vertebrates ideally pre-existed real organisms. That a transspatial world is mnemonically quote-unquote conservative types or psychological ideas once they are invented is an almost inevitable hypothesis. But whether it is the place of types explaining the very invention of organic forms during evolution, or the place of essences explaining the invention of ideas and individual consciousnesses, the hypothesis inevitably seems at the same time fantastic and naive. Maybe I'll stop there. So against the possible anti-Platonic objection, Ruyer's argument is that basically that the facts point to this transspatial, transtemporal continent in nature, as he puts it, and that it isn't the job of the metaphysician to explain the genesis of this other realm, or at least not right away. That it's enough to realize and the facts point to its existence. Maybe could be explicable someday in the future. But then maybe a more serious objection to the Platonic position is that for Plato, obviously the forms are remembered. So we can recognize the forms because we have seen them some space between our previous life and our current life. And this means that the forms kind of always exist. They're static and eternal. And, this may be easier to believe for mathematical truths, but is much more difficult to believe for like the invention of the bicycle or like the invention of like Facebook, for instance. It's kind of ridiculous to assume that somewhere in the neighborhood of like the Pythagorean idea of social media is there waiting. So he hasn't really addressed how invention is possible, Platonic ontology.
Yeah, this idea of the eternal form of Facebook, it brings to mind the philosopher of cognitive science, Jerry Fodor, who has the useful property of being always wrong about everything. So you can just like take whatever he asserts and assert the negation, and then you're almost guaranteed to be right. So his like account of concepts sort of he has this notion of the language of thought, that like there's a sort of universal language of thought in the human mind, and then spoken languages are sort of like translations from this language of thought, and this sort of implies, or this makes it impossible to sort of understand how there could be novel concepts, how like something that was not sort of built into the language of thought is something that we could never sort of by definition ever conceive of. So then the sort of logical consequence of that is that anything that we can conceive of must have been in the logic of thought from the outset. So he just sort of bites the bullet and says, yes, there was a concept of the airplane in the Neolithic. This concept of the airplane was like there in the logic of thought from the beginning, and it was I think not many people would want to follow him along that train of thought. So it's basically the same kind of argument that Ruyer is laying out here. So some person in the Neolithic was painting a horse on a cave wall, and then suddenly stumbled upon the form of the airplane, and then unfortunately didn't have access to steel and fossil fuels and so on to realize this amazing idea. This sort of reminiscence account of our access to the forms that obviously Plato's Meno is like the sort of classic presentation of this idea. So we have access to mathematical truths because there's some sort of like prior access, before our physical lives. We have this sort of access to the forms in this pre-life state. And so, I mean, Plato in that book presents it in this sort of quasi-mythological form where, like, there's this sort of course, reincarnation or metempsychosis where, our soul after our death, moves on to another body, but has this sort of interlude in the realm of the forms. And that's what we're sort of remembering when we, recognize mathematical truths in our sort of empirical lives. But it seems likely that this is not supposed to be like the official version of the theory, that like Plato was not sort of presenting this myth as an actual truth, whatever exactly that means. I mean, the whole the status of these myths in Plato is not that clear in general. But it seems like this was supposed to be sort of like a sort of more a popularization of a more abstract theory, where there would be like this sort of prior knowledge of the forms would be not prior in a temporal sense, like in the sense of there was a time when my soul was floating in the heaven of the forms, and then at a later time it happened to be incarnated in this body. But a kind of logical or metaphysical priority, in the sense that this like knowledge of the forms or relationship to the forms in general is sort of more fundamental than my existence as something that is in a body in a certain place and time. And so this sort of acquaintance with the forms would be more fundamental than my acquaintance with, I don't know, what an apple tastes like, or any sort of empirical sort of sensory corporeal relationship to entities in the physical world. But that's still, I mean, one of the sort of classic objections to this is that we're trying to explain this seemingly surprising phenomenon that people have access to this mathematical knowledge, even in the case of the slave in the Meno, who has not sort of received geometrical instruction. If Socrates asks him the right questions, he eventually lands on the right answer, and sort of understands why it's the right answer, and why his previous attempts were wrong. So we want to explain this, and our explanation sort of points to this prior knowledge, whatever exactly prior means, of the forms. But it seems like this prior knowledge is itself something pretty surprising and difficult to understand. So, like, the question is, why is the soul capable of grasping the forms in this prior state, but not, if we suppose that the soul is capable of grasping the forms in this sort of pre-incarnation state, why is that not the case in when the soul is embodied or incarnated? It seems like we still haven't really we've taken this problem of how the soul, when it's in a body, is capable of grasping the forms, and sort of traced it back to the problem of how the soul, when it's not in a body, is capable of grasping forms. But given that we still have the problem of the grasping of the forms, it doesn't seem like we've really gained anything by supposing that there is this state of the soul, not in a body. We still have this sort of grasping problems problem. Yeah, how does the soul get access to these forms? And yeah, so this is sort of one of the classic problems of this reminiscence account, and then yeah, the notion, the fact that there are seemingly novel concepts, and this of course is especially relevant in, I guess, post-industrial revolution accounts where Plato could more or less plausibly take it that there's this sort of eternal set of forms. Technical inventions were not like a big sort of element of Plato's world. Of course, there were these sort of like mechanical devices that they're mostly sort of like toys or like demonstration machines. There's the famous Antikythera mechanism, but again, it seems like it was kind of like a demonstration device for like astronomical phenomena rather than something that was like essential to everyday life. But yeah, of course, in beginning in maybe the late 18th century, you have all sorts of new technical apparatus that is like a central element of our society, and it seems very implausible to suppose that there was a form of the steam engine, a form of the telegraph, etc. All these things were just sort of floating around in the Platonic heaven, and then someone just happened to stumble upon this form and then put together some pieces of wire in the right way to realize this form. That seems like a very implausible account of how technical inventions happen. And so what Ruyer is going to try to do is to get at what is true about this Platonic account, this idea that there's something sort of pre-existing, a creation or a production of some kind, without sort of having to suppose that this pre-existing is a kind of like one-to-one copy of what ends up being brought about. Because again, that doesn't really get us anywhere. If we suppose that there's this like form of the telegraph just floating around, in the year 5000 BC, this is just sort of like as a sort of brute fact that there just is this form of the telegraph that doesn't really like get us anywhere. We still don't understand why there would be this form of the telegraph, thousands of years before any empirically existing telegraphs were around. What this form like serves to just sort of float around in Platonic heaven. So we want to explain the invention of the empirically existing telegraph, and we point to this brute fact of the form of the telegraph existing, and so we haven't really reached a sort of intellectually satisfying explanation. We just sort of taken the problem and pushed it back into the realm of Platonic forms. So yeah, we want to sort of get at what is correct about this Platonic position, this sort of pre-existence, without having to suppose that there are these sort of ghostly copies of things that have been created in the empirical world that are sort of floating in Platonic heaven, which doesn't really get us anywhere. Yeah, maybe also to sort of explain a little bit more what I mean when I say the getting at what's correct about the Platonic theory. So like Ruyer's sort of central example or central like theme that he's always sort of coming back to is embryology. That you have this undifferentiated egg that develops into a chicken or develops into an octopus, whatever it is. These different organisms, but it does so in a reliable way that like the chicken egg doesn't sometimes become a chicken, sometimes become an octopus, or whatever other thing. There's a very reliable process by which a chicken's egg turns into a chicken, and so there's obviously something that is sort of guiding this process or ensuring that the chicken egg develops in such a way as to turn into a chicken. So there's something sort of pre-existing the developmental process that guides or directs or whatever this process. But at the same time, when you sort of follow the development step by step, it's not the case that there's like a blueprint that is sort of like a copy of the adult chicken, sort of hidden inside this this egg that then just needs to be kind of like filled in. That you carry the little protein bricks into the right place and then build up a chicken out of it. So the same sort of dilemma that he points to with like the the explicability versus novelty is realized in the history of embryology in terms of this debate between preformationism and epigenesis. So the preformationist position is that in the egg there is this sort of blueprint or this like miniature version of the chicken, and then development of the embryo into a chicken is just a matter of sort of filling in that blueprint or taking the miniature version and making it full size. So everything's already there at the outside, and it's just a matter of sort of making it visible to us in the adult chicken. And then the epigenesis side, of course, is that this is not the case. There is no sort of pre-formation of the adult chicken in the egg. That there's a real novelty that the chicken, the adult chicken, is something new that was not already there. And each side seems to have these kind of like insurmountable difficulties. So the preformation side, so one of the sort of seemingly absurd consequences of this is that the adult chicken, of course, can itself reproduce, so it can have offspring. And so if we assume that the adult chicken was already sort of there in the embryo, then it seems that the adult chicken's offspring had to be there as well. And then, of course, that leads to this whole sort of nested sequence of chickens going back to the Ur chicken at the beginning of time, that contained every future chicken sort of nested in like tinier and tinier sort of copies inside this primeval chicken. And then especially difficult for this is something that Blumenbach points to, is that you have, for example, mules. You have a horse and a donkey can mate, and generally the offspring is not capable of reproducing itself, but it's still, so it is possible for a horse and a donkey to mate. So you have to suppose that some distant ancestor of the horse. So you have a horse, say in the year 1700, that mates with a donkey and produces a mule. You have to suppose that like in the year 5000 BC, the distant ancestor of that horse and the distant ancestor of that donkey already had a mule offspring sort of in their sort of micro nested descendant sort of chain within themselves. That like the fact that thousands of years later their descendants would mate not with another horse or another donkey, but with this other species that was already sort of like in their nested chain of descendants. So this seemingly like supremely contingent event of the fact that this horse mates with this donkey was already sort of predetermined thousands of years beforehand, because the requisite mule form, the mule blueprint or whatever, was already there in this horse ancestor thousands of years earlier. Because this seems very implausible. But then on the other side, this sort of epigenesis side, again, the fact that the chicken embryo reliably becomes a chicken and not an octopus or an oak tree or whatever. It seems like if you suppose that there is this novelty, this sort of new creation of the chicken out of the embryo, it wasn't sort of preformed in some sense. It seems completely inexplicable why the chicken embryo should become a chicken and not an oak tree. It seems like you need to have something, prior to the development of the adult chicken, that was there in the egg that ensures that the embryo actually does develop into a chicken and not an oak tree. It seems like a huge coincidence that the chicken egg just happens to turn into a chicken and not an oak tree if there's nothing in the egg that ensures that it becomes a chicken. So yeah, you have this dilemma. Both sides have very strong arguments against the other, but it seems like you can't really because they each have these very strong arguments against the other. It's hard to see how you can sort of pick one or the other. Okay, we can go on to the next bit, so I can read this one. The question changes aspect when it becomes a matter of truly novel information, that is, of invention and not of mnemonic information. Not that it is permitted to make a clear-cut distinction between memory and invention, as we have often seen. On the one hand, a psycho-organic reproduction is never standardized. It is always able to be fine-tuned. On the other hand, an invention is never free. It resembles... Oh, sorry, we read this one already, didn't we? Sorry, where are we? Oh, wait, sorry. Let's restart here. Okay. But when we have abandoned, quote, almost everything, unquote, in Platonism, when we have given up on believing that we can explain the information of our world by pre-existing forms in a transcendent world, we nevertheless realize that something essential must be kept, namely a certain dualism between values or meanings glimpsed by the agent and the laws of the physical world that this agent channels in the direction of this value or that meaning. Even Bergson, who was quick to denounce the quote-unquote ready-made in explanations of novelty, retains a dualism that is fundamentally Platonic when, in a rather clumsy metaphor, he speaks of a, quote, current of consciousness launched through matter, unquote. Matter is only a vague notion, and consciousness is not a current. It is what surveys and frames the auxiliary mechanisms that it assembles and arranges in order to force them to function according to its own axiological direction. But there is certainly in all information a sort of encounter between a conscious theme and harnessed physical laws. Let's leave the domain of abstraction and consider two examples, one very simple, the other very complicated. A. The teapot. The teapot did not arise in the mind of its inventor from an already formed ideal theme, but rather from a reasonable intention, to keep a liquid hot and to be able to pour it conveniently. This intention itself is partly based on knowledge acquired through contact with physical laws. However, it is still a relatively unformed theme. The determined form of the real teapot is born from the encounter between the intention and geometrical, mechanical, and physical laws. It first needs a central body with an opening at the top, since a liquid is subjective to gravity tends to spread out. The base must be large enough to provide stability. Moreover, it needs a spout or pouring channel. According to the law of communicating vessels, the top of the channel must reach the same height as the body. If a manufacturer were to design a teapot according to the model in figure 8.1, such as are used in intelligence tests, he would quickly perceive that the laws of physics protest. So where is figure 8.1? Okay, yeah, so here, yeah, so it's a figure of a teapot where so part of the spout is sort of traced with dotted lines. So we're meant to imagine I guess one version of the teapot would have the spout, the top of the spout would be below the top of the teapot. And we very quickly realized that if you were to pour boiling water into this teapot, it would come out of the spout rather than staying in the pot. And so this teapot would not be particularly useful. Okay, back to the text. Right. Without waiting for this to happen, he makes the pouring tip, quote unquote, conform to the requirements of hydrostatics through a mental experiment based on knowledge of physical laws as much as by a properly intelligent act. In more sophisticated models, the handle must have a low heat conductivity, so the hand that holds it is not burned. The lid must be stoppered by an interior rim, and so on. The form and dimensions of the teapot must also conform to the form and dimensions of the hand and the human organism. But this organism itself, we have seen, is born from the encounter of primitive, vital, quote-unquote, intentions with physical laws, so there is no vicious circle in our analysis. Furthermore, the form of the teapot, like that of all household utensils, is standardized in a craft or industrial culture. It is preserved in a tradition or social memory, just as organic forms are standardized in biological memory. The history of techniques can trace the evolution of these forms across different cultures. B. Astronautics. Astronautics is a very appropriate example precisely because it involves the accumulation of the most sophisticated techniques and even requires techniques that are not yet fully developed. Astronautics is still largely in the state of mental experimentation. It thus allows us to observe the quote-unquote becoming of invention and information because it is also in the process of quote-unquote realization. Real rockets are already built. The effects of high and low gravity have already been tested on animals. We have begun to master nuclear energy, the only energy source capable of effectively propelling the vehicles. On the other hand, celestial mechanics is able to precisely trace in advance from possible trajectories the trajectories advantageous for a given purpose. But it's a faith, an intention of a spiritual and transphysical order that unifies all these partial techniques in order to aim at their realization. Human beings know in advance in what ways these techniques are still insufficient. They identify in advance the incomplete areas that oblige them to further work and invention. Before voyaging into interplanetary space, they still need to make progress in the quote-unquote space of possible techniques. Let us consider more precisely the form the spaceship will take. This form is still, in many ways, a rather vague possibility, as vague as the form of the airplane was for the young Louis Blériot. An artist illustrating a science fiction novel wouldn't hesitate, quote, to move from schema to image, unquote, and represent an interplanetary rocket imprecisely, using details inspired by V2s and stratospheric airplanes. But an engineer is already able to define the thematic possibility of the apparatus more seriously. For example, by taking into account the quote-unquote mass ratio between the fuel and the rest of the apparatus, by determining the necessary density of the protective plating, or by calculating the general form of the interior fittings. with a handheld slide rule, he can eliminate in advance the quote-unquote false forms suggested by the mere association of ideas. In modeling the form of a new engine, what directs him is obviously his knowledge of the laws of physics, and not only quote-unquote theoretical laws, but also, in the Cournottian sense of the word, quote-unquote cosmological situations, such as those prevailing in the regions concerned by human intention. Okay, I'll stop here. Yeah, so again, we're dealing with this sort of passage from something pre-existing, this sort of form, or this, well, again, so he wants us to move away from this idea of a form as this sort of copy of the entity that ends up being realized. And he wants us to move to something more abstract in the sense of these values or meanings that are sort of the direction for processes of development. So, I mean, the teapot example, this is relatively simple. You have this intention. I want to be able to hold this hot liquid in a container and then pour it when I want to. This is sort of the general intention. And given this intention and the properties of various materials like hot water, ceramics, etc. Then, given all these, and then like the way that water and other fluids behave under the influence of gravity and air pressure and so on, the sort of physical realization of a teapot is more or less determined. That like the spout has to be higher than the body of the pot, otherwise the water or whatever it is will just pour out when you pour it into the main body. So like all the sort of central properties of a teapot are largely determined by this intention, what the pot is supposed to be for, and the physical properties of the various materials involved. And so this would be sort of an example of a very simple machine. The teapot is a kind of machine for holding and pouring on demand a hot liquid. You're framing this machine by this intention, the properties of this machine or the general structure of this machine are determined by this kind of coming together of this intention and the physical properties of these materials. So this is obviously a very simple case where you can more or less just sort of know by kind of imagining it and playing things out in your mind. You can figure, okay, the spout has to be higher, etc. Like you can largely figure out how to make a teapot without a lot of sort of study and trial and error and so on. The case of building a space vessel, getting to the moon, for example, is obviously much more complicated. You can't just sort of picture in your mind what you would need to do to build something that can get you to the moon. And so he talks about like a science fiction writer, or you think of like the illustrations on the cover of 1950s science fiction novel. It might have sort of drawn a rocket that looks sort of like these V2 rockets from World War II, but maybe like more futuristic or whatever. But this drawing of a rocket on the cover of a science fiction novel is obviously not very useful if you're actually trying to build a rocket that can get you to the moon. You need a lot more information than this sort of vague idea of what this rocket might look like. But you can, like, even before you've finished this, like you have a real rocket that can get you to the moon, you can still sort of look at what you know already, what you have already figured out, and then you can sort of point to the areas that you still need to clarify. You can say, okay, we know that we need X amount of energy available to get a rocket, or the rocket has to reach this velocity to be able to get out of the Earth's gravitational well. Like that's something I think even in the early 20th century had been calculated. So many decades before, or several decades before it was even sort of remotely possible to do this, you could still say, okay, here's what would be needed to put a rocket into space. And then you can sort of fill in the parts that are not like fully fully developed yet, you can say, okay, we need to find some sort of substance that contains enough energy with a low enough mass that we can get the rocket into space. We need to have X amount of plating on the rocket so that someone could actually survive inside it, et cetera, et cetera. So you can figure out some of these things and then know where the obscure parts are that need more work. So it's the same, basically the same sort of process as the teapot, except that in this case, it's the rocket is so complicated that it's not just a sort of immediate like seeing how things would work in your mind, but you have to actually develop scientific theories of celestial mechanics, for example. You have to build different types of apparatus and test them and see what works and what doesn't, and how you can improve things, etc. So this like complicated technical invention is a result of the same kind of interaction of an intention or a value in this abstract sense, and all these physical properties of materials and the strength of the Earth's gravitational field, all these things. So again, it's the same kind of interaction, and I think this is sort of going to be his like general schema for how invention happens. Not only humans inventing technical devices, but invention in the sense of the embryo inventing the organs of the adult organism, for example. It's going to be this interaction between this abstract value and the physical properties of various materials. So it's this enveloping consciousness, or this enveloping sort of value orientation, and then the enveloped machines.
Yeah, it's a very interesting argument, but I don't really understand how the axiological envelopment is kind of supposed to work. Why should it be the case that I don't know? Why should it be the case that like enveloped machine my arm should move in accordance with these like transspatial values that somehow operating in reality? Maybe Ruyer would just say, well, the facts point to the existence of this realm of values, and it's kind of my job to explain how that conversion happens, but it's a bit mysterious to me.
Yeah, I think so. One of the earlier passages that we read today, so he talks about how there's value in expanding our knowledge, even if we don't arrive at a sort of ultimate explanation. So this sort of dilemma of explicability versus novelty. So here this dilemma seems insoluble as long as we sort of remain at if we take explanation to mean a sort of fundamental explanation, in the sense that it's something that doesn't itself require any further explanation. So it seems like when we grasp a mathematical truth, for example, the fact that say the Pythagorean theorem, to take a simple example, the fact that the hypotenuse of a right triangle is not commensurable with the other two sides. As soon as we grasp the proof of this theorem, it doesn't seem to be any need or even any possibility of a further explanation of why this is true. Whereas other types of explanation, maybe we explain something in terms of something else, but then whatever the something else is, that what we're appealing to explain the first thing might itself also need explanation, or at least seem to allow for further explanation. So if we take some sort of biological phenomenon and explain it in terms of some chemical properties, interactions of certain chemicals, whatever, it seems like we can also ask, why did these chemicals interact in this way? And then we can, look at, the quantum mechanics involved in, the interactions of atoms and so on. But yeah, so this sort of dilemma, this ultimate dilemma between explanation and novelty, is sort of oriented towards these fundamental explanations. We want to have an explanation that is like ultimately satisfying, that doesn't sort of require further explanation. But if we are maybe less ambitious, and are interested in sort of expanding our knowledge, even if we don't reach something that's fundamental or ultimately satisfying, then this sort of orientation toward values might be explicable, or might be useful towards that kind of explanation. So if we, in the case of, say, human action, if we can say that certain people are acting in accordance with this value, and then other people are acting in accordance with this other value, we might gain understanding of these different groups of people's, the behavior of these different groups of people, even if, what exactly it means for a person to behave in accordance with the value and how that, orientation toward a value actually happens might still need explanation. We still gain something, even if it's not sort of ultimately satisfying. So I think Ruyer might say that, so if we are trying to understand, why is it the case that this person's arm moved in this way and, brought about the movement of a coffee cup to that person's mouth, we might appeal to, values. I don't know, drinking coffee is good or whatever. And that might get us something. It obviously is not a sort of final explanation or a final, satisfactory account for this whole process of movement. But I think he would say that getting to the next sort of level of like how is it that the movement of this person's arm is sort of directed by the value of drinking coffee is good or whatever. This would be a sort of a biological problem to solve, that, you would want to understand how, say, the nervous system is structured and how it interacts with the muscles and how the muscles are attached to the skeleton and so on. Like, all these things would be part of your explanation that you would need to develop. But it's not necessarily like a philosophical problem to sort of explain how the value sort of gets filtered down to the arm's movements. It's a question of like, how the arm is structured in such a way that it is capable of sort of bringing about or realizing something that is directed by the value of, coffee drinking is good or whatever.
Yeah. I mean, I agree that at a certain point it just becomes a physiological explanation. But I think there's some point at which there's this value transtemporal world, and then somehow my nervous system is interacting. And then after that, it would be like a physical explanation, arguably. But that initial conversion, like, how that contact happens, I guess, is what I see as like philosophical. Yeah, I understand he's saying, maybe there is a reason for it that we'll understand someday, but it's maybe sufficient to just point out that this kind of explanation is necessary in some cases.
Yeah, so I think here he would probably point to this distinction between like a real form, or so sort of a real unity versus an aggregate. So the arm is a kind of aggregate. It's obviously more structured than, say, like a pile of sand or whatever. But an arm is not a sort of real unit as such. Although it contains real units in it, like the cells of the muscle cells and skin cells, etc., are themselves real units. But I think for Ruyer, what sort of constitutes a real unit is precisely this realizing of values. So it a real unit is a unit in which there is this kind of selection of values, and then something like an arm is a machine that sort of incorporates many real units in such a way as to bring about that realization of values. So me as a unit, I'm responsive to certain values. In this case, a very sort of trivial value of drinking coffee. But by sort of responding to that value, I direct the sort of internal development of each of the units that are the neurons and muscle cells, etc., everything in my arm that is involved in that movement. And then each of those real units in my arm undergoes its own sort of development process, or this sort of micro experience, I guess you could say, of development through time. in light of the sort of framing condition, which is my, at the person level, the intention to pick up this coffee cup. So I think this interaction between value and physical conditions, I think, is sort of a reflection of these sort of two sides of a unit that can be, it has this sort of internal side where it is this kind of selection of a value, and then it also has this external side in the sense that it can be incorporated into another real unit's realization of that value of a different value. So the cell is undergoing this process in a certain way because it is incorporated into this machine that another unit is using to perform some sort of realization of a value. And yeah, for Ruyer, of course, we have these sort of fundamental units, like the fundamental particles that are not themselves sort of that don't operate their value sensitivity by means of further machines. So an electron is not sort of made up of machines, or doesn't sort of interact with machines that are more fundamental than the electron. So there's this kind of intrinsic self-production, I guess, of the electron in response to these values. But then anything more, at a higher scale, like a human, directing themselves to towards certain values, behaving in response to certain values, a human does so by means of all the machines that make up the human body, these sort of huge numbers of cells that are themselves composed of molecules, composed of atoms, et cetera, et cetera. So you have this whole sort of hierarchy of units that operate by means of machines at a lower scale, going down to these fundamental particles.
Yeah, definitely. So if there's this kind of communication between like the true form that is my mind, and all of the true forms that compose the aggregates, which are the machines in my body, then it seems like I have the seeking coffee, I guess, but then there has to be, I guess, some way that that's the monad, or the monads, I guess, in my arm, or the true forms and that communication is like, I guess it seems to me that it either goes straight from a true form to a bunch of machines, or it goes from a true form to like subordinate forms. And if the latter, that's still mysterious to me. It's not clear how true forms interact. Like Leibniz's solution is obviously just, well, God sets up all the monads like player pianos in advance, and they all play out their essences in perfect harmony. But I don't know. It doesn't seem like Leibniz or sign on to that. I don't. It seems like there needs to be some way that they communicate, I guess. But yeah, I realize that he's just said like, well, I'm not going to give all answers for all of these things. So this may be one of those situations where he's just kind of pointing in the direction of the research.
Yeah, it's a good point. I think we discussed, how, what the relationship is between Ruyer and Leibniz in a previous session. And yeah, so for Leibniz, ultimately there is no interaction between these monads. We have each monad has its own sort of preset, development, its own essence. And they're all like these clocks that are wound up at the beginning of time and then just keep ticking along. And the fact that they are coordinated later on is just a result of that they seem to be coordinated. So like the fact that the monads that make up my arm muscles are contracting at a certain time, and in synchronicity with my intention to pick up the coffee cup. This is just the product of their individual sort of life histories all being played out in simultaneity. There's no actual interaction between my intention to pick up the coffee cup and my muscle cells intention, if you want to say that, to contract at a certain time, etc. So yeah, the Leibniz position again is the monads have no windows position. And yeah, so I think Ruyer is not going to sort of accept that account. But yeah, it's not it's not obvious, at least in this book, what his alternative is. So yeah, how is it that my intention to pick up the coffee cup, me as a real unit having this sort of value orientation, and then this individual muscle cell in my arm, having this value of contracting at a certain time. How do those two sort of events in the life history of these two real units, how do they sort of get aligned with each other in such a way as to bring about the movement of my arm in response to this intention to pick up the coffee cup? That I think he doesn't really explain that in this book, or maybe he doesn't. I just don't remember, or we haven't got to it yet. But yeah, I think that's a good point to sort of keep in mind as we read this book and see where it sort of comes up again in different parts. But yeah, your second comment about like how we still, even if we haven't reached an ultimate explanation of how these real units actually interact with each other, it still might be useful. It still might get us somewhere to understand the movement of my arm when I pick up the coffee cup as involving some sort of interaction of my framing consciousness of the intention to pick up a coffee cup with the machines that make up my arm, which are themselves composed of these cells and ultimately fundamental particles that each are themselves sort of realizing a value. So yeah, even if we don't reach a sort of ultimately satisfying explanation, we might still get some satisfaction or some sort of explanatory value by accepting this framework of enveloping consciousness and enveloped machines. Okay, so we spent a long time on the teapot monadology question, but so I think maybe we have time for one more. I do have to leave a little bit early today, so maybe we can read one more and discuss and then stop there.
Okay, that sounds good. On the ground, Auguste Piccard's stratosphere balloon had, for eyes accustomed to ordinary spheres, the surprising form of an elongated pear, with most of the envelope hanging down to a sealed carrier, which was also very different from the usual basket. This unusual form was directly governed by the knowledge of the fact that at an altitude of 20 kilometers, the gas would expand significantly due to the decrease of pressure. In the same way, the deltoid wing of modern airplanes is governed by the special aerodynamics of supersonic speeds. And again, we can easily imagine how everything in the spaceship must be governed by knowledge of physical laws. A teapot in a spaceship would be useless, at least if the journey were not made under constant acceleration. In a weightless environment, a sealed flask would be needed, since the liquid would not pour. On the other hand, one of the important and quite unexpected parts of the spaceship would be the equipment designed to absorb the giant flash that would arrival planet visited between this planet and the ship, the latter having been raised to a very high electric due to the ejection of electrically charged particles. At the same time, we understand the indispensable double role of consciousness. It is, on the one hand, an intention and faith, foi, prolonging the intention and faith that animate all living organisms. Human beings will take over the planets of the solar system, driven by the same faith that animates the lichen taking over the old wall. It is, on the other hand, absolute survey, that is, unqualified knowledge of domains where statistical physical laws reign. Consequently, it is able to anticipate and channel the inevitable effects of these laws instead of merely being subjected. A quote-unquote possibility of intention does not materialize on its own like a quote-unquote possibility of fun. Suppose that the astronauts would not have thought to neutralize the difference of potential produced by the functioning of the nucleus. This oversight would not put a stop to the physical laws at play. These physical laws would destroy the vehicle on Earth. In the manufacturing of basic tools, the method of trial and error can replace, to a small extent, the consciousness capable of mental experiment. But in advanced techniques, this method is impractical. The invention of the form must take place with foresight by means of protections or preventative channels. Moreover, it can be said that the invented form is initially nothing more than a set of preventative protections and channels that directly express the differences between an unsurveyed domain, where physical laws operate through step-by-step interaction, and this surveyed domain. Protective membranes and channeling tubes, the rudimentary organic or technical machines, are hardly more than that. An elementary organism is made of membranes and tubes or vacuoles, quote, to inform, unquote, a domain first to enclose and channel the dangerous exterior forces. A further step consists of using the channel of the physical laws by making work according to the guiding intent. A combustion engine or muscle motor channels the work of the interplanetary rocket itself is still theoretically only a tube and accelerated by the energy of the forces that it channels. The realization, of course, is terribly complex. The V2 rocket, whose principle is so simple, had such a complex piping system that it was nicknamed Plumber's Night. The complexity of the spaceship will certainly be dizzying. The machine will be to the V2 an organ, but the fundamental principle of information of a physical domain remains the same, a channeling of physical forces. Bacon's axiom, quote, natura non nisi parendo vincit, is not only a profound statement, it is one of the most profound ever to be pronounced. It emphasizes the inevitable dualism, and it provides the secret, which was missed by the diverse theory of the production of. In the case of astronautics and the spaceship, every one of these theories appears inadequate. The eternal idea of the spaceship is even more risible than bicycle. Equally risible is the mechanist that explains the of the spacecraft either by mechanical sort, natural select, or by some sort of when the role of faith is as evident that of mental experience. As for dialectical explanations, one already feels nauseated just imagining the sentences that a contemporary Hegel would write on the subject. Let us move on to irrationalist theories. Engineers would shrug their shoulders at these ideas when they fight against obstinate and inflexible physics, painfully seeking a narrow path in technical impossibilities that are harder and steeper than boulders. The astronautic adventure is nothing of a quote-unquote adventure in the existentialist and literary sense of the word. Human liberty, which will one day enable man to wander around the solar system and exploit all its resources as he sees fit, has little to do with the, quote, metaphysical emergence of an absolute freedom with forms. The slow and laborious manufacture of the necessary machines is nothing like a free emergence, nor a sort of spontaneous conversion of the intensive to the extensive, the schema to the image through sheer. This is a compelling idea that invented forms are invented from a kind of difference between physical laws, which are to some degree understood or at least manipulated in some way. Case of very simple organisms on the one hand, and an absolute survey, which is kind of axiologically oriented on the other. And I think the idea is the most rudimentary form of this is something like a cell wall or something that affords some protection from exterior forces. And then maybe in more complex cases, there's a greater and greater domain of absolute survey that grasps more and more physical laws, but is still axiologically oriented and kind of signifies, I guess, in Simondon's sense, this disparation between the physical domain, the axiological, and invents things like V2 rockets and spaceships.
Yeah, there's a kind of this duality of the absolute survey and then the operation of these statistical aggregates. He wants to sort of hold on to this duality as being sort of characteristic of invention at every scale that or maybe with the exception of the fundamental particles, but even the simple teapot example, you have this intention, I want to have a means of holding hot liquids and then pouring them when needed. That intention to be realized has to harness the sort of aggregate properties of the substances that make up ceramics and hot water, etc. So you have to take these statistical properties of these aggregates, make use of them in a certain way to realize this intention. And this is also the case in the chicken developing into the chicken egg developing into the adult chicken. It has to sort of harness the properties of the different chemicals that are being taken up by the egg and then arranged in a certain way to form organs and so on. And then of course the V2 rocket example is just the sort of infinite degree of complexity of the same type of operation as in the case of the teapot. So you are taking some sort of very schematic intention of like, I want to launch this thing, up into the air and have it land somewhere else with explosives in it. To be able to take this, very general intention and make it into an actual concrete object, you have to, put these machines together in a certain way that allows you to harness the properties of, burning fuel, for example, to, eject the hot gases out of one end at a high speed to make the whole apparatus fly, for example. So this sort of harnessing aggregates, harnessing the behavior of aggregates in such a way as to realize an intention. I think this is like his sort of general schema for how invention happens. The sort of edge case here is the electrons or other fundamental particles. The electron is not harnessing any aggregates. Seemingly, it just sort of is the realization of something like an intention for Ruyer. I think he would just say that it's we can only understand it by analogy with intentions in the human case, but it presumably is not identical to an intention. But it is not. It's a sort of immediate realization process. It's not the electron is not inventing its future behavior by means of a machine at a smaller scale. So he wants this. Maybe electrons are just trying to get a cup of coffee, and that's where all the rest of the universe comes from. Is building all the elaborate machines that allow for coffee drinking to happen. So he sort of runs through in this last paragraph. He runs through like all these different versions of the two opposing sides of holding on to explanation and then losing novelty, or holding on to novelty and losing explanation. So he runs through all the different variations, and he sort of shows how they all none of them gives anything that looks even remotely satisfying when you're talking about something like the development of a bicycle or development of a spaceship or whatever. The idea that there's a sort of eternal form of a bicycle floating in Platonic heaven is very I'm sort of picturing Hegel talking about the rocket ships. He says it would be nauseating. The rocket ship as like in contradiction to the gravity of the Earth or something. It doesn't sound very promising as a account of that we would get a Hegelian account of the rocket ship. So any of these sort of accounts of a bicycle is in some sense a relatively simple machine. It involves it doesn't involve sort of any high tech. Today we have of course carbon fiber bicycles which are more advanced, but most of the components of the bicycle could have been manufactured probably in like the 17th century. A lot of like it probably would have been a very clumsy bicycle in terms of like the metals that were available were probably too heavy and so on. But there were gears and chains at the time. It's just that no one sort of had the idea to fit them together in this way, and the materials that were available probably would have made that sort of realization of a bicycle out of like solid steel maybe not that useful. But it's also a very sophisticated machine in the sense that it like gets the job done very well. With no sort of superfluous parts, and if you think about like there were sort of like the early bicycles with the giant wheel that we sort of laugh at, but then once the sort of modern form of the bicycle with the two equal size wheels, once that was developed in the early 20th century, it basically hasn't changed since then. It was sort of perfected, and then there's no need to really do anything to make it any better aside from you have incremental improvements in terms of like carbon fiber instead of the various other metals that or the various metals that were used in earlier bikes, and maybe improvements in the gear shifting mechanism and so on. But like the basic form of a bicycle hasn't changed. So this sort of technical invention that was it's fairly complicated, but also kind of uses relatively simple mechanical properties of these objects. Gears and chains and wheels, these are all sort of simple machines. They don't involve any, quantum mechanics or anything like hard to understand. And learning how a bicycle operates is not that complicated either. You can sort of like directly see how the pedals are turning the gears and turning the chain, which turns the wheels. You can just sort of see it happening. So in this case, you can sort of see the direct kind of interaction of like the intention of moving faster than a person can walk using a wheel. This kind of vague intention, and then getting from that intention to an actual apparatus made of metal or carbon fiber that brings about this intention. This is like a kind of you can sort of like see it. You can almost see it happening, like in the sense that the mechanical properties of these parts that are arranged in the right way are sort of immediately obvious to the eye when you sort of look closely at a bicycle as it's operating. Yeah, so I think in general, I think this like invention of a bicycle is kind of like a model for how he wants to understand the creation of novelty in general, or the emergence of novelty in general. So we have some kind of intention, some kind of physical principles that we understand, or that are harnessed in some way. And then the question is just like how are those physical principles brought into the right configuration to realize that intention. So in the case of the biological examples that he gives, like the cell wall is like the sort of most fundamental of these inventions, because it allows for the inside to be distinguished from the outside. You can have like a different concentration of chemicals inside versus outside, or a different temperature inside versus outside, etc. So you can sort of protect a certain state of the inside against the environment that might have a very different state that would, without that cell wall, equalize temperature or equalize the concentration of certain chemicals, etc.
Yeah, and as to what we were talking about earlier with like where the forms are preserved once they're invented, I think he mentioned in this section there's this social preservation. So like it's there we can use our capacity for like symbol, ensure that we don't forget how to make bicycles, basically. Although it's like conceivable that for some reason everybody stops riding bikes, becomes very unfashionable or something, in like 1,000 years, the form of the bicycle has kind of been entirely lost and would need to maybe be invented. And so maybe it's not that it's it is this kind of transspatial or transtemporal type, but yeah, maybe kind of requires the socio-cultural memory in order to remain regularly instantiated, capable of being instantiated. Although I don't really know how that would forms invented, so to speak, by inorganic forms, for instance. I guess forms memory largely genetic. Yeah, maybe he's addressed that issue of where the form.
Yeah, actually, he talks about biological memory in his book Elements of Psychobiology. So yeah, that's a whole separate question of what exactly biological memory means, and reproduction. But yeah, the bicycle invention example is interesting, because this is like exactly the problem that archaeologists face in many cases, where you have some thing, you dig up something that is clearly made for some purpose. It wasn't just a sort of random assemblage of parts, but it's not always obvious what that purpose was or how it was used. And of course, also the difficulty is often that you don't have a complete artifact. You might have the metal or stone pieces of it, but then you suspect that there was probably like a wooden handle or twine that held things together or whatever that has disappeared over time. So you have some sort of often incomplete technical apparatus, and you have to sort of reconstruct what the intention of this apparatus was. And in some cases, like I know in the case of these like flint tools, like archaeologists have actually had to basically just like reinvent flint knapping techniques. Like how do you take a lump of flint and turn it into a knife, for example, based by chipping away edges, pieces to make an edge and so on. So sometimes to understand an artifact, you have to sort of like reinvent that artifact and say, okay, given the shape and structure of this artifact and the fact that we're able to reproduce this artifact using or produce something similar to the original artifact using such and such a technique, we can sort of hypothesize with some confidence that the artifact was actually produced in this way with this intention. But yeah, like you can like the technical knowledge needed to produce a VCR, for example, seems unlikely to be around in like the year 2500. So sometimes the capacity to produce a technical device of some kind might disappear if, for whatever reason, that technical device is not sort of constantly being reproduced, and people are not learning how to produce that device in future. So maybe archaeologists of the year 2500 will be like digging up VCRs and trying to figure out what the hell this like bizarre thing was used for. Yeah, maybe Facebook. Yeah, archaeologists will be reconstructing what Facebook was for. Okay, yeah, so I have to head out. But yeah, thanks everyone for coming out. This was, I think, another good section. I think this chapter might be one of the more interesting chapters of this book, getting at some of these like really fundamental questions that kind of run through the whole history of philosophy. So yeah, we're getting to the good part.
Yeah, it's been a great chat. Yeah, thanks, Nan. Thanks, 61. I'll see you all next week.